What if I told you the fastest growing political group in America isn't Democrat or Republican? It's neither. And what if these voters, mostly men over 40, don't trust either party, but must decide who controls Congress in 2026? Hey guys, it's Delana. Today I'm doing a deep dive into three things that might change how you see American politics. First, the real numbers behind the independent surge and why it's not what you think. Second, what these voters actually want based on fresh data from Pew and Gallup. And third, why both parties keep getting it wrong and what that means for you. And according to Pew's research, latest 2024 data, independent identification has grown steadily over the past 4 years. But here's what the headlines miss. And I just wanted to show you guys this graph here, which is very interesting. You can see the surge here of the independent voters over the years. And you can see back in 2000, it was less than 25%. And now they're heading towards 35%, which is very interesting. So these numbers tell a big story. And what's most interesting is that these aren't college kids having an identity crisis. The largest growth segment are men between the ages of 40 and 65. Now, before I go any further, I want to be crystal clear about what we're looking at. When pollsters ask, do you identify as Democrat or Republican or independent? Roughly 40% of people say independent. But when they follow up with the question, which way do you lean? Many still pick a side. And I thought that was very interesting. So you can see this chart here where you get the people right in the middle, the 7-8%, but then once they start to pick a side, you can see there is a big shift of which they definitely lean to a particular side. And according to Gallup's tracking from 2024 through mid 2025, it shows something very interesting though. The true independent number, people who won't even lean, has grown from about 9% to estimates ranging from 12 to 15%. So they've never seen that before. Like I said, it's always been between that, 7 to 9% you see here. But as they go through past this 2025 number and it's gone to 12 to 15%, I think people are very confused. And again, that doesn't sound like a huge margin, but it's a 50-50 nation, and 3 points on either side makes a huge difference. And, it is definitely going to be a squeaker. And you can see here the men, there seems to be this big discrepancy. There seems to be a lot less. The Democratic men are going down, and I think that's because of the woke agenda. And then I think that also here, the amount of Democratic women is going high because, I don't know, a lot of the Trump policies they don't like. There's a number of reasons there, but yeah, it's those independents are going to be a big difference in the midterm election. But here's the kicker. These voters are concentrated in exactly the districts that decide who controls Congress. As you can see from this map here, where the independents are mostly is right there in middle America. But who are these people? Because if you listen to cable news, independents are either confused moderates who can't pick a side or secret partisans lying to pollsters. But the reality is a lot messier and more interesting. Now, let me show you what the data actually reveals about independent men over 40. First, economically, they're everywhere, not just wealthy suburbanites fleeing Trump, not just working class Democrats fleeing wokeness. The distribution looks like as you can see here, it's literally middle America. And secondly, geographically, they're not just in purple suburbs. Rural counties and red states, urban areas and blue states, classic swing regions, independent registration is up across the board, across the country. And third, and this is the most crucial thing, their issue priorities don't map cleanly onto either party's platform, which brings us to the biggest question both parties are asking behind closed doors. Like, what do these people really want? And I think that there has been just a huge trust collapse. The trust in the media from 1972 to 24, Gallup data shows that the percentage of Americans with a great deal or fair amount of trust in the mass media has declined significantly. In the 70s, it was ranging from 68 to 72. By 2024, it reached a new low of 31%, which marked partisan and age-related divides. which I thought was very interesting. God, I remember when I was a kid, when you watched the news, they were just talking about the news. You never really thought, am I watching a Democrat station or am I watching a Republican station? Like you were watching the news, and that's what they were giving you, just the news, just the facts. But that's just not the case anymore. So to understand these voters, you have to literally start with trust, or rather, the complete collapse of it. Gallup trust in major institutions annually, and Congress, media, big corporations, even local government, all are at near historic lows amongst this whole huge demographic. But here's what's fascinating: when you dig into the crossroads, independent men over 40 don't just trust institutions equally. They have a very specific pattern. They trust local institutions more than national ones. They trust people they can name and contact over faceless bureaucracies. They trust processes that can observe over black box algorithms. This shows up in their relationships with information too. Recent platform changes around content moderation, whether you call it free speech restoration or moderation rollback, pulled differently with the group than with the core partisans. Now, I want to be very careful here because the data is still coming in, but early indicators suggest independent men are more concerned about censorship than misinformation, while still wanting accountability for genuine harm. It's nuanced position that doesn't fit neatly into either party's talking points, which might be exactly the point. And I think the whole thing that has come down recently with Charlie Kirk, the whole thing, hate speech versus free speech, and Jimmy Kimmel, I think that's been a huge, huge issues. And of course, everybody has their side. And I don't know if it's not a bipartisan thing, but it's like hate speech is hate speech, and then free speech, and there's the argument there, and I think that goes on both sides. So I think ultimately, from the research that I've done, I think independents just want to be able to. We can't lose free speech in this country, and of course, that doesn't. It's not a free for all. However, that goes on both sides. People don't wanna lose their voices, and that's, one thing I've learned for sure with all this research that I've been doing. But trust isn't just the philosophical issue for these voters, it's very practical. Now, I wanna walk you through what I call the 40 plus squeeze, and that is comes down to economics. And inflation has just not only grown over the years, it's accumulated. And I was fascinated by this graph because I know you see the percentage inflation has gone up and up and up, and then Trump's really got a handle on it, but there has really been an accumulation effect that was wow. It really hits home, to where the prices, because I have personally not seen a lot of the prices go down. Gas is back up to $3.40 a gallon. You know, egg Some grocery costs have come down, but not a lot. If anything, I've seen a lot of things go up. So inflation is definitely still an issue, and they've just dropped interest rates a little bit. But, if you were 40 to 65, you remember when a decent house costs like 3 times your annual income. But now, this is the home prices have just skyrocketed. Now they're literally 8 times the normal annual income. And what you're watching is your purchasing power just erode despite how many working hours, and your health insurance, if you have it, costs more every year while covering less. Your kid's college tuition makes your student loan payments look quaint. And then here's another big issue. And it's not necessarily with the 40 to 65-year-olds independents, but it's the younger generation. And actually, I was listening to a lot of what Charlie Kirk was saying, and he was actually talking to Tucker Carlson about this, which I thought was very interesting for two right wing guys to talk about. And it's that the regular people, you know, that have come out of college, they like no one can afford a home anymore. And it's a huge deal. Like I'm looking for a just condo for my son, like a 2-bedroom condo with a garage. He's got a Tesla, so he needs a garage. We got to get him a garage. And it's like he makes a good almost he's 21 years old. He's making a good $150,000 a year. And it's hard to find him just a house that he can afford at 350. He's got no wife, no kids. His biggest expense is golf and, going to Vegas once in a while or going to California, that's his big expenses, and it's just like he has to literally roll it in. He's been saving and saving for, a house, but it's I couldn't imagine if he had children, uh, to have to pay for stuff, and that's a pretty good wage, and he has no student loan. He came right out of high school and started a job and is doing well, but it's really hard, and then it brings us to the retirement. You know, Financial advisors say you need $2 million now to have saved to maintain your lifestyle. And most people have an average of $47,000 in their retirement. And with the big beautiful bill, they're trying to cut benefits to 25% off. So if you're in these age groups, you're going to have to make that much more to keep up with if they didn't do the cut. So it's just gonna be harder and harder, and I was listening to Ben Shapiro, um, the other day. I think he was on CNN, and he was saying, "Well, people they shouldn't plan to retire at 65. They should be planning to you can't just go off and lay on a beach somewhere and retire. If you're 65 years old, you're able to work, keep working," which is true. I agree with that. Everybody can keep working after 65. 65 isn't what it used to be years ago. And then someone else clapped back, who was another right winger, clapped back at him and said, "Yeah, well, that's true. Like, we're spending all this money in Social Security for older people in retirement. But hey, if we had that money that we were spending on wars in Israel and Iran and everywhere and giving money to Ukraine, hey, maybe we could have that money to help people retire more." So, anyways, guys, let me know your thoughts on that one. I think retirement is a very big issue. And then that comes to, you know, crime rate. Both parties really don't have a solution with this, and again, circle back to the economics part. Republicans want to cut taxes on people that are richer, and then Democrats want to expand these programs, and then we're saying that we can't afford it. So neither addresses like really the core issue. Why does everything cost so much more than it used to? Wage growth versus asset inflation, it's going off the charts. And independent voters aren't confused about economics. They're frustrated that neither party talks honestly about the financing of housing policies, why productivity gains don't translate to wage gains anymore, and which brings us to security. And I don't just mean foreign policy. The crime rate here in the States is going up like exponentially. And I think it has a lot to do with immigration, in my opinion. That could be very controversial, but I really do think that, you know, especially with independent voters, they talk about security. They're not thinking like the traditional left right terms. They want safe neighborhoods, but they also want protection from like really economic catastrophe. They want secure borders, but they also want job security. They want national defense, but they also want to defend their savings from inflation. But what you might call comprehensive security, and neither party's current platform addresses it comprehensively. On immigration, for instance, most independent men support both border security and pass to legal status for long-term residents. That's not it's not contradicting yourself. It's very complex, and then again we circle back to the the war and how much money we're actually spending on the war, and a lot of that money could go to security and putting money back into our own country. So then gets to an energy. They want both energy independence and cleaner air for their kids. They're not climate deniers, but they're skeptical of policies that seem to ignore economic reality or national security implications. Here's what's really interesting, though. When you ask about foreign policy, independent men are neither isolationist or interventionist. They're very, very strategic. They want America strong enough that other countries think twice before testing us, but they don't want endless wars with unclear objectives. They want support allies who contribute their fair share. They're skeptical of allies who don't. And I really think that's been a huge issue. A lot of dependents, they're fine with defense spending if it goes to actual defense. They're less enthusiastic about subsidizing other countries' defense while our own infrastructure crumbles, i.e., Israel. Again, all roads lead back to Israel. But perhaps the biggest security concern for this demographic is one that neither party wants to talk about, honestly: the security of open debate itself. Now, I know this is where things get spicy, so just let me present the data here. Multiple polls from 2024 show that independent voters over 40 are more concerned about restrictions on speech than almost any other demographic. Not just government censorship, corporate censorship, social censorship, the whole ecosystem. The recent changes in content moderation policies access across all the platforms poll better with this group than strong partisans on either side. Now, that doesn't mean they want a free for all. The data suggests they want transparency and moderation decisions, consistency in application, and protection for good faith political debate. They're also deeply skeptical of media institutions, not because they're anti journalism, but because they've been watched journalism become increasingly indistinguishable from activism. Which brings us to the biggest question. If your independent voters are growing and their concerns are this complex, why do both parties keep misreading them? And I did a video the other day on um, here's some more statistics on the border security. It is a huge issue for everybody. I don't think that's any big surprise, and it will continue to be. But to go back to the censorship, I just did a video the other day on Twitter about the not Twitter, TikTok, and they are putting the people that they have in charge. Now, the United States has taken over 80% of the Twitter feeds here, so they say keep the data under our own country, and it is houses the Texas Project, so they have taken control of that. But the people that are in charge now of the Twitter in the United States are right in bed with Israel and AIPAC, and the person in charge of the hate speech on TikTok that's going to monitor the hate speech on TikTok is an ex-Israeli intelligence. Anyway, I think that, again, they're not listening to these independent groups that I think that we would want someone a little bit more neutral to be in charge of that, but that's just my opinion. But, but here's the really uncomfortable truth for political professionals: independent voters are harder to message to because they actually think about each individual issue. And Democrats assume that if you're not a Republican, you must agree with their entire platform. Republicans assume that if you're fed up with Democrats, you must love everything they're selling. But both are wrong. Independent voters might support universal health care and deregulation. They might want higher taxes on billionaires and lower taxes on small businesses. They might support both strong environmental protections and domestic energy protection. But these aren't contradictions if you think policy by policy instead of team by team. But our political system is run by people who think in teams. Campaign consultants, party officials, media personalities, they all have incentives to force complex positions into tribal categories. And apex is one of the big issues. I know there are some politicians, again, I did another video on this about, you know, some politicians are pointing out concerns, and if it doesn't follow what the apex is behind, they're just wiping out those politicians. So I think it is harder every day for, I think politicians really need to figure out who their independent voters are and cater to those each individual messages, because it's going to be, I think that's what's going to win the election. So if you have these margins at 3% either way, and you can get that independent voter, you can swing your party over to the other side. And I think they're really missing that demographic. So what's the result in all of this? Messaging that sounds like it was focus grouped to death because it was independent voters can smell inauthenticity from a mile away. They've been lied to enough by politicians to develop pretty good lie detectors. They're also a structural problem. Both parties are increasingly dependent on donors and activists who are tribal. The people who give money and time to political campaigns tend to be more partisan than the voters' campaigns need to win. And primary elections dominated by the most partisan voters in each party. So candidates get selected based on their ability to excite the base and then to pivot to appeal to independents in general election. Independent voters see right through this game, which is why authenticity polls so well with them. And when they're drawn to candidates who seem to believe what they're saying, even if they don't agree with everything. But here's what might surprise you about the 2026 midterms. And if you can see this electoral map here, it's very interesting to see where the midterms are going to go and which direction they're going to go. If current trends hold, independent voters won't just influence the 2026 midterms, they'll decide it roughly 30 House districts and 4 to 6 Senate races. Independent voters will outnumber the margin between traditional Democrat and Republican coalitions. That creates an opportunity for politicians smart enough to speak to their actual concerns instead of trying to jam them into tribal boxes. A platform for really focus on economic security, institutional transparency, and comprehensive immigration reform and energy independence could potentially appeal to independent men while not alienating traditional base voters. Whether anyone will be bold enough to try that approach, that's the $1 billion question. But here's what we know for sure: independent voters show up. Their turnout rates are higher than casual partisans. They research candidates, they spill tickets, and they're not going anywhere. So whether you're independent yourself or just trying to understand American politics in 2025, keep an eye on this demographic. They might not be the loudest voices in the room, but they're increasingly the ones deciding who gets to stay in it. And I really looked at this graph here and showing where a lot of people are thinking about the job approval rate of Donald Trump, and it seems to be diminishing. Immigration has definitely been 100%. I think he's on top of that. Deportation, I think people are happy about that. Overall, seems to be lower than he's in the negative. Jobs in the economy, trade, and inflation and cost of living seems to be his lowest issue. I really think that for the Republicans, they have to really look at this and see where they're losing on each one of these issues. I think they can't do anything with immigration. I think it was just such a clusterfuck. They have to double down on getting a handle on it. So I don't think that's ever going to change the deportation. But overall, I think they have to start looking into the economy, the jobs. I think that they have to really start being clear on where they're getting their funding from. And like APACs, I think they have to address Israel. I think that's a huge issue. And then they got Pam Bondi coming out saying, oh, we have to stop the hate speech. And I think that they really have to define what hate speech is and what is free speech and be crystal clear. Because I think that a lot of Republicans and Democrats are going to vote against anybody that's going to stop the free speech. So, anyways, guys, let me know your thoughts. I think politicians are missing these very, very independent voter base. And it's really those independent voters are really going to decide that election, because essentially this country is pretty much 50-50. So if you can sway those independent voters either to one side, but I really do think it's going to have to start looking at all these different issues individually and find out where they're losing and clarify. I also think the Epstein files has been very detrimental to the Republican Party, and that's when I talked about before, transparency. Independents want transparency. They want authenticity. They want to be told the truth. They want cost of living. And you can see in this graph here, that's the most thing that they're unhappy about with the Trump administration. I really thought it would be more of a turn to the economy. And I'm in the real estate business. I've seen housing prices just skyrocket. Here in Scottsdale, I think the homes are, they're getting up over $1,000 a foot. An average home in Scottsdale is probably like $500+ a foot. I'm selling these properties up in North Scottsdale. There's one house that we have 2,800 square feet. It's $3.3 million on a postage stamp of a lot. Someone right behind, little bit of view. It's just prices are skyrocketing and people want to be able to buy a house. And like I said, I thought it was great to hear Tucker Carlson and Charlie Kirk. It was one of the things he was like, hey, what I'm fighting for is for the average person to be able to go buy a house and have that American dream. And I think that with the housing costs skyrocketing, wages aren't catching up, and it's just very frustrating. And then on top of that, they're sending all this money over to fight wars that I don't know if we signed up for. But, anyways, guys, let me know your thoughts. Please like, subscribe, share, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks. Bye.